Thank you, President Hunter, members of the board, Dr. Lokaboff. As President Hunter stated, I'm a partner at Duane Morris LLP in the firm's White Collar Criminal Defense and Government Investigations Practice Group. Over the past few months, Duane Morris, on behalf of the school district, has conducted an independent internal investigation into allegations of wrongdoing by the school district. Earlier today, a 147-page report of that investigation's factual findings was delivered to the school district. The school district has requested that Duane Morris present a summary of its factual findings, recommendations, and conclusions at this public meeting tonight. In tonight's presentation, as well as in our accompanying report, you will see actual source documents and contemporaneous communication. You'll be able to see for yourself what people did and said. You'll be able to understand the data for yourself and draw your own conclusions. Although at times we anonymize individuals or redact certain sensitive information, our report is much different than the ACLU administrative complaint that was released in October of last year. Our work does not contain wholesale page after page redactions. Rather, the school board, in commissioning this investigation, pledged transparency. At the end of my prepared presentation, I believe President Hunter has set aside time for questions from the members of the Board of School Directors. This investigation was led by me and my partner, Bill McSwain. Both Bill and I are former federal prosecutors, and Bill is the former U.S. attorney for this district. We're joined in this investigation by our partner, Mary Hansen, a former assistant director of enforcement with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, and an experienced white-collar and investigations lawyer. We brought together a team of lawyers from the firm's white-collar and education practice groups with experience conducting investigations and responding to government inquiries. Our investigation focused on the 4 complaint letters we received from the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which I sometimes will call OCR. Let me talk about each of those complaints. First, Andrew Burgess, who was formerly a teacher at Lenape Middle School and who is now a teacher at Unami Middle School, filed a complaint with OCR alleging that the Central Bucks School District suspended him from teaching on May 6, 2022, in retaliation for providing the parent of an LGBTQ student with information about OCR, and Mr. Burgess's filing of an OCR complaint alleging sex-based discrimination by the district. Second, in early May 2022, just after Mr. Burgess was suspended by the district, a week-long series of walkout protests occurred at Lenape Middle School. An unnamed complainant filed a complaint with OCR alleging that the school district refused to allow LGBTQ students who walked out of school to re-enter the school after they had walked out, and that constituted discrimination and retaliation against those LGBTQ students. Third, the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania, or the ACLU, filed a complaint with OCR alleging that the district failed to respond appropriately to the harassment of students based on their sexual orientation, and gender identity. Finally, a complaint was filed with OCR by an unnamed complainant complaining about certain policies that the district had adopted or was considering adopting. At issue were policies prohibiting teacher advocacy in the classroom, requiring parent or guardian permission for student name changes, mandating age appropriateness for library books and classroom materials, and providing that the once-a-year elementary school human growth and development class be conducted in separate sessions for boys and girls. We asked OCR about the identity of the complainant, but OCR refused to provide that information. In sending us these complaint letters, OCR did not provide the school district with the actual complaint. And in fact, OCR refused to do so. Rather, we were only provided summaries of the allegations. In conducting our investigation, the school district's only instruction was to investigate and to document the facts. The school district did not put any limits on our investigation, nor say that any witnesses or documents were off limits. Instead, the school district administration promptly provided access to documents and witnesses whenever we requested them. Now let's talk about what we did during this investigation. We conducted 45 interviews. Teachers, guidance counselors, administrators, and members of the community. We also reached out to LGBTQ students and their families. We reviewed over 123,000 pages of documents and electronic records. These included correspondence, disciplinary records, policies and procedures, video recordings and photographs, notes, and social media. I want to show you what we've put together here, and I'm going to show you this at various times during tonight's presentation. And what I'm going to start with, as I indicated earlier on, is the first of the 4 OCR complaints. And that is about the Burgess retaliation allegations. Let me just set the stage. During our investigation, we found that in the spring of 2022, Mr. Burgess failed to report allegations by a student, who we will call throughout this presentation and who is referred to in our report as Student 1, who was then a student at Lenape Middle School. That Student 1 had been physically assaulted, threatened, and subjected to a variety of slurs. Instead, Mr. Burgess directed Student 1 to report these allegations only to him and not to others in the school district, including guidance counselors or administrators. Mr. Burgess convinced Student 1 that guidance counselors and administrators at Lenape would not help Student 1, and that only he would help Student 1. Rather than reporting this alleged harassment of Student 1 to the principal of Lenape Middle School, Mr. Burgess actively concealed it from the school district administration. Based on our investigation, the evidence shows that Mr. Burgess had an ulterior motive for taking these actions. In December 2021, a newly elected 6-3 Republican majority on the school board took office, following the November 2021 municipal election. Shortly after this new school board was inaugurated, the board began considering the adoption of policies, including ones concerning the age appropriateness of library books and classroom materials, with which Mr. Burgess disagreed. the evidence and circumstances suggest that Mr. Burgess believed that if he brought to light supposed widespread unaddressed bullying and harassment of LGBTQ students and convinced a federal agency to investigate such matters, the school board would cave to the inevitable criticism and bad press, particularly if Mr. Burgess, aided by the press, could convince the public that the school district's new policies were the actual cause of such bullying and harassment. Now, in addition to student 1, our investigation has shown that Mr. Burgess manipulated a second student, who we will call student 2. And with that, I'd like to turn to the first source document that I'm going to show you, which is an email from student 2 to Andrew Burgess, dated March 3rd, 2022. And in this email, with the subject line, "Transphobia will not be yassing in our school," student 2 writes to Mr. Burgess, who again is a teacher at Lenape Elementary School, middle school rather. "Today in gym, I heard," and again we've anonymized the student names here, student 3, "angrily explaining the pronoun situation to his friends and trying to excuse his actions while bashing student 4. The same day, student 1 sent this email to Mr. Burgess with the subject line, "Other things that have happened." And I'll leave this up there so you can see some of the allegations of physical assaults, threats, and slurs that student 1 allegedly suffered, and which on March 3rd, and I want you to remember that date, March 3rd, 2022, he reported to his teacher. Now, what did Mr. Burgess do with this information? He wrote back, "Thank you for sharing this information with me. I imagine taking the time to put all of this in writing must have been quite difficult. I plan to update you the next time we speak, and I deeply appreciate your courage to come forward with this information, Mr. B." So now the evidence shows, and this includes metadata that we collected from documents taken off of Mr. Burgess's work computer, that Mr. Burgess used the information in that email to create a dossier of allegations of bullying and harassment that were allegedly suffered by student 1. And even though, as you will hear and as is alleged in the ACLU complaint, the reason why Mr. Burgess did not report this to others in the school district was that he wanted to protect student 1's privacy, the evidence shows that Mr. Burgess actually created this document in his classroom with both student 1 and student 2 present. So you'll see it's organized by column. The student, which I'll represent to you as the perpetrator, again we've anonymized or redacted the names. The date or approximate date and time or approximate time. What happened, witnesses willing to come forward, and the location of the events. And I think it's important to take time with this document because it's so important. So here's one entry. You see student 3, the alleged perpetrator. The first item supposedly occurred on 3/3. So again, the same date that the email was sent. Insisting on dead naming a student while being reminded of the student's name. Apparently student 4 would be a witness. And this happened, this black box is the name of a teacher that we've decided to redact in that teacher's first period class. Now, I want to remind you that these are merely allegations. We conducted a very thorough investigation, and one of the things we did is we talked to that teacher. And even though the events happened some time ago, the teacher had a recollection of it, and it didn't quite occur in the way that's described here. For instance, the teacher did not mention to us any alleged dead naming, which is a term for using a transgender person's former name when that person now uses a new name. But what is important is that this teacher told us that she corrected the situation and addressed it at the time. The other thing I want to show you about this document is that it shows that some of the conduct is ongoing and repetitive. So we see here once or twice a month, weekly as part of a large group. I'll show you another entry. This one allegedly happened in January. Ice thrown at student 1, and after hitting him with the ice, made a statement that I'm not going to repeat here. Here's another. Yelling at the student, tripping him, calling him another word that I'm not going to say here tonight. These events supposedly happen in the hallway. Some of these events happen 3 or 4 times a week. And here's another one. This supposedly happened in September. Student 8 was allegedly the perpetrator, and student 1 is called all kinds of names that I'm not going to repeat here tonight. This is a 4-page document. I've shown you the first 2 pages, which is a matrix. Pages 3 and 4 contain additional information about these allegations, and they're all in the report. So we had an opportunity to interview Mr. Burgess as part of this investigation. And this interview was under oath, and it was transcribed. And we're going to be showing you some of the things that he said during the course of that interview. But this one here, you need to let it sink in. And did you ever report any of the information that student 1 gave you to anyone else at the school district? And his answer was, no, I did not. Now let me give you a little bit of background so that I'm not assuming too much knowledge. I have that initialism up there, BDR. Some of you may know what that is, the Behavior Data Report. Maybe what, when I was in school, was called an office referral or a disciplinary referral. It's a method by which to report misbehavior, and it's used in some of the schools in the district, including at Lenape, both then and now. And unlike when I was a kid, where it might have been a pink slip in triplicate, this is a computerized system. But you submit a BDR to report misconduct by students. And one of the things that you will have remembered from the ACLU complaint is that Mr. Burgess, or at least the ACLU, alleged there was no requirement to submit BDRs. So one of the things that I did in the course of this investigation is to see what else was Mr. Burgess submitting BDRs for during March 2022. After all, he did not submit a BDR for the items that were on the dossier. And here is an example. This is a student who gets written up by Mr. Burgess for not putting his laptop away quickly enough during a peer presentation. Here's another one. March 10th, literally a week after he receives the information from student 1, he writes up another student for sharing energy drinks. Still no report of anything from the dossier to the school district. Now, this is a name that you may or may not be familiar with, Janine Salo. Janine's a graduate of Penn State. She's been an educator since 1993, public school administrator since 1999, and she is and was at the time the principal of Lenape Middle School. And she writes on March 11th, 2022, she wants to check in on student 1. She writes, "Hello all." This is to the teachers who have student 1 in class. "I know earlier in the year, student 1 was experiencing some negative attention from peers. I was wondering if you have seen anything lately or if things have improved. Just checking back in. Thanks for any input you might have." Remember, I told you to keep in mind that March 3rd date, because this is March 11th, not too much later. The information should be fresh in Mr. Burgess's mind. So this is what Mr. Burgess writes back. "Hi Janine, I hope you're doing well. Student 1 has talked about some of these interactions with me and they do not seem to have improved. Thinking ahead to next year, student 1 seems to be very friendly with these students if they can be placed together in classes if possible." Some student names there, which we've redacted, and some students that he seems not to get along with, and there's some additional names. So Mrs. Salo gets back to Mr. Burgess. "Thank you. Please encourage student 1 to bring these things to our attention. I would hate to see suffering in silence. I've noted the list below in our scheduling database for next year." And I want you to note Mr. Burgess's response, "Will do," and "thank you." That wasn't true. Instead, the next morning, Mr. Burgess writes to student 2 with a set of reminders. Who was involved? Where did it happen? Who else was there? What exactly was said and or done? Mr. B. Now here's what student 2 writes back. "Thank you for your concern about the student 3 situation." And I'll just refer you back to that March 3 email. It was about that student 3. "I have told the vice principal," and this is somebody you're going to hear more about, Lauren Dowd. She is and was the assistant principal at Lenape Middle School, "about the harassment from him since we last spoke, and it should be cleared up soon. I'm emailing you to ask if I should still give a timeline of the harassment or leave it at this." So this is Mr. Burgess's response to that. "Hi, student 2. Good for you for reporting. I know it can be awkward and painful to review what happened more than once. I'm sure Mrs. Dowd will be taking it from here." And that's an important email because of what isn't said by Mr. Burgess. So you may have read in the ACLU complaint that there's deliberate indifference, the administrators won't do anything. But that's not what he tells student 2 after student 2 has already reported the information to Mrs. Dowd. He says, Mrs. Dowd will take it from here. Now, the 2 students were particularly vulnerable. We interviewed the parent of a gender nonconforming child who told us that her child told her that student 1 had made suicidal comments to Mr. Burgess. This is a report from a teacher, again, whose name we've blacked out here, to Janine Salo and Lauren Dowd about this student 2. Regularly says outlandish things. Admits that most, if not all, things he said are made up, and he doesn't stop. You see the suicidal references. Says things like he's been bullied. I think he may be legitimately unstable. Also, back to student 1, witnesses also told us that student 1's mother herself had difficulties navigating the school process and personnel. And I want you to keep that in mind, particularly as we go through some of the next slides. Now, this is Janine Salo's response to this. And Janine Salo is one of the people that we interviewed. And she thoroughly impressed us. And I just want to tell you that you have good people in this district. And I know we're talking about one particular person a lot, but overwhelmingly the teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, everyone we met really impressed us. And this is the type of thing Janine Salo would do. Get right back and address the issue with respect to student 2. Now here's another teacher, Roberta Gluck. She's a French teacher at Lenape and the head of the Gay Straight Alliance there, which goes by the name SAGA. You see the acronym there. And she says, I spoke with student 1 today since we didn't have SAGA yesterday. Student 1 reports that there have been no bullying harassment incidents where he is the victim since March 3rd, i.e. 2 weeks. I told you to keep that March 3rd date in mind because that's curious. The only people who knew about that report, student 1 and student 2 and Mr. Burgess. And also, if you think about that dossier, you saw that the alleged abuse was ongoing. Remember that 3 or 4 times a week. Seems implausible that it would just stop on the date when the report is made to Mr. Burgess, but that's what's being reported here. So Janine writes back. She says, Robbie, thanks for your response. Please send me the names of students that have been communicated to you from student 1. The student 1 report when this is happening. Any info you can provide would be great. Thanks. And here is Mrs. Gluck's response. And you'll see that student 1 told me it was the same ringleaders that the students talked about in SAGA a few weeks ago, and there's some names there. We'll talk about student 5 in a bit. She says, for example, student 5 has been known to launch himself through the air onto the lunch table where many of the LGBTQ students sit. Now, we dug into this a little bit, and here's what we learned. An individual by the name of Stephen Albert, who's a former assistant principal at Lenape, requested that Ms. Gluck obtain information from students in the Saga group at Lenape and to report it to him about alleged bullying so that he could then send a compilation email. And we have found that email. It went to certain members of this board, Borough of Doylestown officials, Superintendent Lucabaugh. It was not specific in terms of individuals, but we think that this is where this information up on the screen came from. Now, this email also plays a very prominent role in the ACLU administrative complaint, because what the allegation is that Mrs. Salo was told who was doing the bullying and then nothing happened. We'll get back to that in a bit. Roberta Gluck then forwards that email chain to Andrew Burgess. Now, before we get back on to those three students and what happened, I want to stick with the timeline. I think it's useful to put things in chronological order. What else is going on? Well, here's Andrew Burgess. Remember, you have to submit a BDR. This is an email chain about BDRs. And you'll see here there's actually a BDR entry. The BDRs are classified. Right? There's technology offenses. There's different kinds of violations. And one of them is harassment, which is defined as the delivery of repetitive, disrespectful messages in a format related to gender, ethnicity, sex, race, religion, disability, physical features, or other protected class. The difference between bullying and harassment is the protected class. And the person here indicates it is a major. There's two categories of offenses in BDR, minor and major. And Mrs. Salo said it was her expectation that major offenses had to be reported to the administration for obvious reason. So Mr. Burgess knows this, at least by March 22nd. But we were also told, by the way, that Mr. Burgess played a role in developing the BDR system and was even planning to give a training on the BDR system. But at least by March 22nd, 2022, he says, good to know, thanks for checking in on this. So what else did Mr. Burgess know about the BDR system? There's an internal chat feature on Microsoft Teams that teachers can communicate. In November 2021, pick me in fantasy BDR ball. I am going for a new personal record today. BDR City, let 'em rain. Next stop, BDR City, connections to Ineligibility Station, Conference Town, and Detention World. He also shows a lot of knowledge about how the system works. Hey all, I'm doing a BDR minor for work refusal. This is defined as defiance in BDR. I'm hoping it piles up enough to turn over to a major. This one was about a teacher where there was a biting incident, by the way, in another classroom a month ago. Mr. Burgess will still write it up. So the great chomp of 2021 happened in October, still writing both students up. Now, what about the administration's response to these BDRs? This is what Andrew Burgess said in private among his fellow teachers. Something I really like this year is how prompt Lauren Dowd has been with responses to BDR reports when I submit them. I think I get a reply either the same day or the next day with what is happening with it every time. There are very few people in their places of work who can be said to address a problem every time the same day or the next day. but that was Mr. Burgess's analysis of Lauren Dowd's approach to this sort of thing. So what about the policies of the district? What I'm showing you is a chart that should be very familiar. It's appeared in student handbooks, district calendars for a number of years. Very useful chart. It's a disciplinary matrix. And it's ranked here. Level 1 is the least serious. Level 4 is the most serious. And so there's actually a category for repeated bullying behavior, which what is described in the dossier would easily qualify as, and it requires administrator involvement, and it carries very significant sanctions, including suspension. Again, the dossier just allegations, but if true, very serious according to Policy 218, not to mention common sense. The board also has a Policy 104, talks about discrimination, and it encourages students, employees, and third parties who believe they or others have been subject to discrimination to promptly report such incidents to the building principal. I want you to remember that that's the policy that this board adopted. It is to encourage reporting to the building principal. And think about that as we go through the next few slides. Now, what about what Mr. Burgess said about his obligation to report? And you'll see we asked him about that. And you said that you knew you were under an obligation to report instances of bullying, discrimination, harassment to the extent you couldn't resolve them in the classroom, correct? His answer was right. And you agreed with me that the ones involving student 1 you were not able to resolve in your classroom, correct? Yeah. So it stands to reason that those are ones that you'd have to report to the administration, correct? Answer, yes. So what did Mr. Burgess tell student 1 and his mother? Did you ever tell student 1 or his mother that the administration wouldn't do anything about it? He answers, I said that I had concern that the district may not, based on my experience of being in the district for 14 years, but I did encourage them to do so. But you told them that you had concerns that the district wouldn't do anything about it, right? Answer, I did. And so then I ask this question here. Right, so you're telling this parent that you have concerns that the district won't do anything about him being called these words. His answer, right. Now, telling a 14-year-old and his mother that you have concerns that the district won't do anything about all of those things on that dossier is tantamount to telling them not to report it to the administration. Now back to Janine Salo, because students one's mother actually did want to reach out to the school district. She called and didn't leave her name, but Janine Salo didn't let it drop. She uses caller ID to track this person down. And what she was told by this teacher, and remember this is right after this March 3, she stated that she was told by the teacher that the district does not have things in place to address her concerns. That's what this teacher told student 1's mother, according to these notes. Now, Mr. Burgess, as it's alleged in the complaint, provided student 1's mother with information about OCR. She is referring to an OCR complaint form, because remember that's what Mr. Burgess wanted to have happen, that federal investigation. But student 1's mother wasn't completely on board, but she said she was confused about how this complaint form would help student one in the short term. So this is what Janine Salo said. I would be able to address her concerns. She shared information about student one and student one's friends. And it says, I suggested that we set up a time to have student one meet with Mrs. Schrack, the school counselor, to express her concerns and feelings. If disciplinary items came out of it, Mrs. Schrack would share those with the administration. I want to point this out as well because remember, one of the allegations, and we'll get into this later on, from the ACLU complaint is that when this all came out, no one from the CBSD administration reached out to student one or his family. It's documented. And so again, remember that date, March 16th? Mrs. Salo doesn't waste any time. She does exactly what she said she was going to do, which is arrange for supports for that child. You see here, I think he may have been confiding in a teacher and nothing makes its way here. And by the way, Mary Kate Schrack, another person we interviewed. Sounds great, I'll see him tomorrow. And we document this along the side. Mrs. Salo calls student one's mother, March 16th. Meetings with guidance. Prompt. Lenape administrators and guidance meet with student one's mother on May 11th. Now back to Mr. Burgess. So remember I told you earlier about that ulterior motive? Mrs. Salo sends out an email to teachers at Lenape saying, if you have a classroom library of books that students have access to, please see me when possible, thank you. And Mr. Burgess, in just 13 minutes, interjects himself in, wants a group meeting. He's the union vice president and asserts that this is a disciplinary meeting where union representation rights are triggered. Now, meanwhile, March 23rd, he still hasn't reported any of the allegations from the dossier. But 13 minutes after Janine Salo's email goes out, he's on the book issue. Now remember we were talking about the lunchroom and the ringleaders, Roberta Glock's email, and the ACLU saying what it said about that. This is the part the ACLU didn't tell you, which is one of those students, remember that student 5, actually does get written up for a major BDR, by the way. 2 ninth grade students reported to me. And here's the allegation. BDR gets issued. And Roberta Glock is informed of the consequences. And in fact, she writes Lauren Dowd. Well, I said this about Janine Salo, but Lauren Dowd's also an educator we interviewed. And we were similarly impressed by her and her dedication and her skill. And wait till you see this. Lauren, when student 5 does earn cafeteria privileges back, so the discipline was he was on a lunch detention, could you inform the cafeteria duty aides of this and perhaps have them station themselves closer to the table of students in our LGBTQ community? How does Lauren Dowd respond to that? Well, just about a half hour later, she says, yes, I will let them know. To which Mrs. Gluck says, merci. So here's where the timeline sits right now, ending on that March 29. Lauren Dowd promptly responds to that concern about the cafeteria, takes action in multiple ways. So what happens next? Because by this point, still no report of the dossier's allegations. This is an email from Robert Carey, the staffer at the U.S. Department of Education in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Office for Civil Rights is reviewing your correspondence, which we received yesterday. So that would be April 13th, 2022, over a month after the March 3 email. Now, Mr. Burgess also told us that he mailed his complaint to the OCR office. So we actually went back and saw what was the Department of Education saying at the time. This is from a recent screenshot, but we also determined it was on the Office for Civil Rights website at the time. This is sort of remarkable. It's April 2023, but the majority of the OCR staff are still working remotely because of the pandemic. So if you want to ensure receipt of your correspondence, you can do email or fax. Right? You can mail, but there may be a delay. So Andrew Burgess was interviewed by school administration, and these are the notes of that interview. And this is part of the basis for our determination that there's an ulterior motive, because he's referencing the national issues regarding bullying and discrimination. He also replied that nothing that was reported to him warranted reporting. Now, Mr. Burgess was still at Lenape in very early May. And there was a policy at Lenape that was born out of an issue. And I'll explain a little bit of the background, talk about it more later on, where a student had changed her name without her mother knowing. The new name is printed in a program for a performance. The mother is very upset. The mother complains. And the school district took the position, for reasons that I'll explain later, that what a child's name is really needs to be based on parental consent. And there are good reasons for that, which we'll get into later on. But this is communicated to the staff. Now, this doesn't apply to students who've already have that consent, have already officially changed their name. But nonetheless, Mr. Burgess approached the student in advisory class. He typed words for me to read instead of speaking to me. He wrote to me that he can only call me by my birth certificate name, and if I wanted something different, my parent needed to call, even though my parent and I already met with guidance about this. So I was confused about why he approached me, but I emailed my counselor anyway.
I'm sorry, I can't continue to listen to this. We are revealing student identities by sharing this information.
We are not. We are not identifying anybody.
There's a lot of quality
By the actions that are revealed in these emails, clearly the students are going to know who this is about. This is horrifying.
Agreed.
I just can't.
Sorry, it is horrifying. It's horrifying to see that this child was bullied and that this person didn't do anything about it.
Yes, ma'am. It's horrifying that you're
Okay, can we
using lots of
continue?
information
Can
about
we
the incident, and
continue?
other people will know who it is.
We voted to
This
hear
is
this.
not. This is
Can
not
we
okay for a student's identity to be revealed
No
in this
one's
way.
identity
No one's
is being
identified.
Was it
They are
okay
being
that this
revealed
child
It's all
suffered
a
all
joke.
that time?
This is all
We
a
need to
joke
mute-
narrative, and I can't believe I'm sitting here. It's
If you
disgusting.
If these children suffered
You
all
are
of this
applauding
time.
the people that you have decided are the good people. you're giving credentials and college degrees and talking about their credentials and not the others.
These are their words.
Have you talked about Mr. Burgess and how he was celebrated, how he got awards? I didn't hear any of
These
that
are
on the
his
other
words.
side. It's such
right.
a biased presentation.
These are his words.
This is so biased. It's
If you
ridiculous.
can't,
If you can't
allow-
handle it, then
Well, it's exactly what you wanted,
you
right?
can't
This is
allow
what
the-
you all
if you don't
paid
like
for.
the truth, I'm sorry.
It's not the truth. It's your truth. It's your
Wow. Wow.
Dr.
I
Dr. Mahmood,
apologize.
if you want to read the truth, you can read
couldn't
exactly
read it.
everything
I couldn't read it.
Burgess.
Order.
I
You
couldn't
can
read it.
read
Instead, you
everything
made a
Burgess
public
said.
show.
Enough.
I couldn't read it.
Please.
You read it.
Wait,
You
I'm
read
sorry.
it.
Wait, did you just say
Stop.
we made a
Lisa,
public show?
Lisa.
You did.
I've been living a public show for the last year and a half because of you.
Please.
Don't
Mr.
engage.
Rinaldi, please continue. If there are members that don't want to hear this, then please leave.
Yeah.
But the board has agreed to the presentation and to
No,
the
the board
public
did not.
having access. That's what the board vote was. I'm sorry you
You're
disagree.
putting
I'm sorry to
students
the
at
community
risk
that
with this.
their taxpayer money was spent on this tonight.
And you're putting students at risk.
May I continue?
Please continue,
Please
Mr. Rinaldi.
continue.
So on May 6th, Mr. Burgess was suspended. Here's the reason why. What the investigation has revealed to date is that a child in your school has suffered multiple incidents of bullying by one or more students in your school. Not only were you aware of the situation, but you directed the child and the parents not to report the incidents to the principal, claiming that the administration would not do anything to alleviate the situation. Now, I'll point out during our investigation, we learned about the second student. This relates to student number 1. In addition to the above situation, it has also been brought to the attention of the principal that you directed teachers in your building not to speak to the principal who needed to confer with teachers with respect to issues of appropriate reading materials being made available to students. The purpose of the conversation was to inform the teachers as to the district policy with respect to such materials and was not in any way a disciplinary hearing. Now, Mr. Burgess also spoke about Marlene Prey. And so I asked, and when you got this letter before you spoke to Ms. Prey, correct? He said, no. I think the conversation we had on the phone was before this. I think it was in April. So then I asked him, I said, did you tell Ms. Prey that that one of the reasons why they were upset with you was that you failed to make a report to the administration of discrimination, harassment, or bullying? He said no. Now, he then calls for a break. He had a union representative there. He was out of the room for 7 minutes. And he came back and he told a different story. So after you got the letter, you spoke to Marlene. Answer, yes. What did you tell her? I told her the contents of the letter. Now, we asked Marlene Prey during her interview whether Mr. Burgess provided this information to her, and her attorney told her not to answer. So here's where the timeline sits thus far. Mr. Burgess is suspended on May 6th. What happens next? The walkouts. So we see here a social media post. Join the protests. Bring back Burgess. Every day this week, May 10th to 13th. And these walkout protests did affect Lenape Middle School for 4 days straight in that second week of May. And what was the effect of these walkouts on Lenape? This was documented at the time. The social media campaign appeared to be from Marlene Prey. It was joined by more adults who gained entry to Lenape Middle School via their cars, disrupted school by honking horns and waving flags and signs. One vehicle jumped a curb. You see CB Regional Police there. So food was brought on in order to entice the kids out of the building, which worked. They left the cafeteria to get the food items. Significant disorder in the cafeteria as a result. This had a particular effect on special education students who are particularly affected by disruptions in the routine. So this is a Lenape special education student ramping up all week due to the distractions, became violent, attempting to hurt herself and others. 4 Lenape staff members had to restrain the student. All 4 staff members sustained injuries as a result of this, and the student was taken to Doylestown Hospital. The students were out of control. 300 students in the cafeteria. Remember, there's between 800 and 900 students at this school. Were up, running around, and many of them were pressed in the door jambs. A riot-like situation. Now, one thing Mrs. Salo did was contact, or at least attempt to make a contact with parents whose students had walked out. This is one parent who writes to Mrs. Salo. She said she's there to learn, not to leave the protest. One parent's view of the protest. But Mrs. Salo did try to make contact so that those kids could be taken care of. And this was all over social media. Let's end her career. A death threat, R.I.P. Mrs. Salo, she done for. That was made by a student at Lenape who cited the protesters as the reason why he made that threat. One of the school board members said, "I also did not vote to remove a teacher who supported gender nonconforming students." And that was in the middle of the protest. Now, the allegation by the complainant through the Office for Civil Rights is that students were kept out of the building, locked out, and that was due to their LGBTQ status. So we really wanted to dig in on this. We interviewed individuals about this, but we also wanted to see what were people saying at the time, right? Because sometimes what happens at the time is a better understanding. And we do see the secretary here, who, by the way, sits right there, would be in a position to see it. 3 girls came in and confirmed they were in for the rest of the day. They were told if they did leave the building, I needed to know. This is an email from Lauren Dowd to Janine Salo. Right, I'm writing to provide an update on today's walkout. Currently, we have 4 students and 1 former student who are sitting on the curb outside of the 200 hallway. These students have been made aware that they're out there, and they've all been marked absent. In order for them to re-enter the building, they'll need to check in at the main office. And there's actually a very simple reason for this, which is school shootings. We just don't run public schools where kids can come and go through any door that they want, prop them open, and have carte blanche. And Janine Salo and Lauren Dowd, to their credit, try to accommodate these students and said, listen, if you want to come in, just please come in the main door. And that's the door with the intercom, with the locks. And we wrote OCR, we explained this. Nonetheless, the federal investigation on this issue alone has gone on for 4 months and has involved 26 document requests and subparts covering all kinds of information about the school district's operations going back years. We also informed OCR that this school district is going to continue to maintain its school safety requirements regardless of its investigation. The other thing is that Mrs. Salo was concerned about disruptions to school. If you let kids in any particular door, it disrupts the education for the kids who decided to stay in school, the overwhelming majority. We think that's a valid basis as well. But in any event, there was no discrimination against LGBTQ students. Students were allowed in, provided that they proceeded through the front door. There was one exception to that. That was that student of the parent who didn't want her kid protesting, and that was to make it so mom could pick the student up. That was the one exception. Now this email, I think you have to read and take it in. This was sent by a student at CB East High School on May 13th, 2022, the last day of the protest. This is to Janine Salo. You are a vile, repulsive idiot who does not understand the law. Protesting is completely legal, you absolute, I'll leave out that word, moron. You are more scared of these middle schoolers than they are of you. I cannot wait for you to either step down or be removed from power, because one of the two will happen. F you and every surface level thought your puny brain has. High schoolers are now organizing to come show support for the children affected by your bigoted legislation. Again, completely legal. Keep calling the cops on us and we will continue to show up. ACLU will cover our story. Now let me make two observations about this email. The first is, you don't pay Janine Salo nearly enough money to put up with this stuff. The second is, this young lady has given away the game. She has explained exactly what happened that week, which is outsiders descended on Lenape Middle School to disrupt the school's operations in defiance of lawful police orders, and the ACLU was right behind them. And you don't have to believe me, it's right here. Now what happens next in the timeline? The board takes a vote on the first reading to Board Policy 109 and 109.2. It's these book policies. So what happens next? Because the board is considering this, there's public debate. This is what happens next, which is Karen Smith, member of the Board of School Directors, sends an email directed to Secretary Cardona, that is the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Miguel Cardona, and Assistant Secretary and OCR Head, Catherine Lehman. And she's reaching out, these are her words, because the majority of the school board took an action that she didn't like. She goes on to explain the policies that upset her: human growth and development, student names, suspending an exemplary teacher for protecting a transgender student, and just the consideration of a library book policy. She also mentions that the ACLU of Pennsylvania is investigating our district. And then she says this: I would appreciate any support your office is able to give me in fighting these issues for our LGBTQ students and our other marginalized communities, which is an explicit call to weaponize federal investigatory resources. And so what does the Office for Civil Rights do? It launches 3 federal investigations of this school district. The first one is about that, as she called him, that exemplary teacher, Andrew Burgess. The second is about those policies. Look familiar? And the third is that ACLU complaint. Now, I want to go back to the timeline, because on August 18th, 2022, Mr. Burgess comes off his suspension and agrees to certain things, including that he'll report immediately any and all instances of bullying. He'll not instruct, direct, or support the parents or students who should not seek assistance from the administration for any instance relating to student bullying, discrimination, etc. Still no report of any of the information in the dossier. Now, one thing that Mr. Burgess testified to was that an attorney at OCR knew that there was harassment, bullying, or discrimination of a child. And Mr. Burgess told us that he actually sent a copy of the dossier to OCR, either in full or redacted form. And I asked him, and that's because you told him that, right? His answer was yes. And you also told him that it had never been reported to the administration, correct? Yeah. And did you tell him that the bullying was ongoing? Yes. Based on our investigation, OCR never reached out to the school district with this information. Instead, Mr. Burgess got an email saying that that complaint that he had filed ostensibly on behalf of Student 1 had been closed by the U.S. Department of Education. In fact, we've never received a complaint regarding that subject. On November 2nd, this appears in the Huffington Post, a picture of Karen Smith prominently displayed. And I want you to compare Ms. Smith's email to that September 23rd letter from the Office for Civil Rights. You can see that the issues are very similar. Now, on November 15th, 2022, the board took a vote on whether to commission this independent investigation.
I can't approve spending what is likely to be tens of thousands of additional taxpayer funds to defend this legal action, which so easily could have been avoided.
Okay. So we then wrote to the Office for Civil Rights, and we wanted to know the identities of these students for a particular reason. The first was that if the ACLU's allegations were true, then our client, the school district, would want to take all necessary and appropriate action to protect those students. Student safety is of paramount concern to the school district. That was the first reason we wanted the information. The second reason is that the district is committed to thoroughly investigating the allegations. And finally, we assume that the department was interested in doing a thorough and unbiased investigation, but if we don't know who the individuals are, we're hamstrung on our ability to respond to the department's request. The department lawyer told us that that information was irrelevant. And we wrote that we disagreed with your current position that allegations of individual discrimination, that the children are irrelevant. We wrote that. The next thing we hear from OCR is we get hit with another complaint. And this is about the walkouts. That there's an allegation that by keeping the LGBTQ students out, which didn't happen, that was discrimination and retaliation. So that's the fourth OCR complaint. Mr. Burgess appears in the New York Times on January 1st, 2023. He says, but I was concerned that I would be complicit if I became aware of this information and allowed it to sit. January 1st, 2023, the allegations in the dossier are still not presented to the school district administration, and Mr. Burgess had learned that the OCR investigation was closed. So here's our timeline. So the other thing we learned during the course of our investigation is that Mr. Burgess received additional allegations from 3 parents in the school district that their LGBTQ students had been discriminated against, and in their opinion it wasn't resolved. I asked them anything else you recall about those conversations. No, just besides being deeply disturbed by it all. And I asked him, I said, okay, and because you were so deeply disturbed by it, I assume you ran right back to the administration and reported it. The answer was no. So additional allegations. So before we move on, let's take on the two of the complaints. The first is about the Burgess retaliation allegations. We've shown you the district policies. We've shown you that Mr. Burgess did not report them to the administration. We showed you that Mr. Burgess discouraged student 1 and his mother from reporting, and that Mr. Burgess interfered with school operations. In our view, the discipline was not retaliatory, rather it was justified, and it's our recommendation that the board suspend Mr. Burgess without pay. The next is the walkout allegations. Again, Janine Salo, Lauren Dowd, others in the school district responded appropriately, and there are those well-established school safety protocols that were important. So let's talk about the third set of allegations, the bullying allegations. What we tried to do, we attempted to identify and speak with the students. Of course, the ACLU's allegations are heavily redacted. I actually wrote to several parents and sent letters and email, and I got back a response from the ACLU lawyer, which is described in the report. I wrote to these individuals on December 21st. I actually got an email back the same day from student 1's mom offering to do a Zoom call. And then on December 26th, I got an email from the ACLU's lawyer who would not disclose his clients. The interviews never happened. We've interviewed personnel at each of the district's 23 schools, including each building principal. We reviewed files and records, and we've identified those incidents of LGBTQ discrimination that did occur. Some of them did, but we'll show you what happened. So one of the things we asked Mr. Burgess, and we did this of a lot of the witnesses, because we were really curious about this, and the individuals we selected to interview, some of them we thought we would hear information from. And we thought Mr. Burgess might be able to tell us about unaddressed harassment or bullying. And so I asked him what his experience was based on, that 14 years of experience in the district by which he thought the district wouldn't respond. And then he mentions a couple of incidents that do not relate to LGBTQ issues. And then I asked him, okay, and you're not even aware, second or third hand or otherwise indirectly, of any instance when there was an allegation of discrimination, harassment, or bullying that was reported and unresolved? Right? The answer, right. And I asked him, so other than student 1, you're not aware of a single student by name who suffered discrimination, harassment, or bullying based on sexuality, sexual orientation, transgender status, or any similar characteristic fair? His answer, fair, I don't know their names. So then we continued to dig in, and we asked him his opinion about the toxic environment in the district. And you can see his response there. But you're not aware of any hostile environment in any school in the district today? Answer, I wouldn't say so. What do you mean you wouldn't say so? I'm sorry, I would say no. You're not aware of that? No. In fact, even as to Lenape, you're not aware of it one way or the other today, right? His answer, right now, yeah. And this was a common theme throughout our interviews. We would ask individuals for specifics so that we could dig into them, understand them, and see whether they had actually been resolved. And witness after witness failed to come up with any specific instances of reported and unaddressed bullying or harassment of LGBTQ students. Indeed, some of the best evidence that that is not widespread in the district is Mr. Burgess's interactions with student 1. Because if the district were really awash in that type of discrimination, he wouldn't have needed to conduct himself in that way with student 1. So let's go through the ACLU's various allegations. As you can see, there's a lot of redactions there. But there are a few specific allegations that we are able to look at. And I'm going to assume these are the best, right? The ones that they're going to publicly put out there. To date, CBSD has not identified any policy or protocol, assuming that's Mr. Burgess, failed to file. I think we've talked about that already. Plenty of policies and procedures. Despite the primary stated reason for the suspension being failure to report bullying, nobody from CBSD administration has reached out to, and again, I'm assuming that's student one or his family, regarding a plan to rectify bullying conditions. But that was done by Janine Solo. In fact, you saw the documentation of this earlier this evening. And this is the email from Mary Kate Schrack, the guidance counselor over at Lenape. And we were very impressed by her and Courtney Nolan. So this one is what I'm calling ACLU claim number 3. Blank, who I'm assuming is Andrew Burgess, determined that blank, who I'm assuming is student 1, was not in any imminent danger and respected blank and his family's request not to submit a BDR. CBSD does not have any policy requiring teachers to submit BDRs. There's a lot to unpack here. The first is, I don't know where this imminent danger test comes from. Because remember, and we saw this earlier on, Mr. Burgess was writing up students for not putting away their laptop quickly enough. Okay? Further, look at the dossier. If true, how could you conclude the kid was not in imminent danger? Again, they're just allegations, but that's what we have. Now, I don't know whether student 1's mother knows what a BDR is, or what it even stands for, but it's beside the point. Because she wasn't afraid of the Lenape administration. In fact, she was reaching out and stating her confusion about how the complaint form would help her son in the short term. Completely undercuts the ACLU's allegation. Now here's ACLU claim number 4. We've heard about these lunchrooms. And there's 2 allegations here, and I'm going to take them in reverse order. The first is this one student for the 2022-2023 school year had been eating lunch in the bathroom to avoid bullying until staff caught them and ordered them to a remote hallway location. Now, the ACLU doesn't say who that is, but we did a thorough investigation. We interviewed a lot of people, and the evidence shows that's student 1. And we actually interviewed the staff member who found him. And what that staff member told us was, he wasn't in the bathroom because of bullying. He was in the bathroom because his friend group had broken up, and he had no one to eat with. And this staff member didn't order him to some remote location. She said to him, just pick a place you want to eat and I'll walk you there. That's what happened. The other thing here is, near the end of the 2021-2022 school year, you see the LGBTQ students are too afraid to go to the cafeteria, but you've seen a document about that as well. Remember this document? Look at what Roberta Gluck writes about that. This is right around that time, you see? March 2020. There's a table for the students, the LGBT students, in the Lenape Middle School cafeteria. And we remember all the work that Lauren Dowd did regarding that. The other thing I'd point out about student 1 and that first incident, right? Student 1's back in school that fall. Dossier still has not been revealed. Keep that in mind. Here's another incident, claim number 5 by the ACLU, and this is a particularly explosive one. I will point out it happened in 2019, so before the November 2021 election that the ACLU points to. But we actually talked to staff regarding this incident, And before this attempt at suicide, the staff did not know that this student was transgender and represented there was no bullying on that basis. And the student did have mental health issues and was placed in placements because of that. In other words, the school district did everything right in this circumstance. It's an unfortunate instance that there are kids who have real mental health issues. It doesn't mean that the school district is guilty of relentless anti-transgender bullying. In fact, the people we spoke to weren't even aware that this student was transgender or identified as such prior to the suicide attempt. Now here's another one. You heard about the CHOP gender clinic training, and that it was abruptly canceled. Here's the reason why it was canceled. This goes back to Andrew Burgess. He actually submitted a petition seeking an extended lunch period for special education teachers. Because of that, the class couldn't be held because it was during the lunch hour. It wasn't anti-LGBT discrimination. The evidence shows it was because this petition to have equal lunch periods for special education teachers as regular education teachers was granted by the school district. Let me show you another ACLU claim. This is about CB Cares and the allegation that this also evidenced anti-LGBTQ discrimination. So we actually just went back and we saw what Dr. Lukabal said at the time. And the issue was, it just wasn't performing the role of an education foundation. And I know a lot about this. I was a former school board member. The whole purpose of an education foundation is to provide grant money in support of activities programs beyond the school district's budget. So I just wanted to test and see whether what Dr. Lukabal said panned out. So what I did was I just pulled the 990 for the CB Education Foundation. And I see it got $176,000 in contributions, made only $15,000 in grants, and salaries and compensation over $111,000. So then what I said to myself is, well, how does this compare? Maybe this is normal. So I looked one county over. You may have heard of North Penn School District. I said, how does it work over there? Oh, here it is. Contributions and grants close to $200,000. There's the grant money. Salary, zero. And I said, I remember when I was a school board member, right? We had one of these, right? Well, how did it go there? Same thing, no salaries. In fact, this one actually made some money. See that line there? Right, and paid out grants. Wallingford Swarthmore is not as big as Central Bucks School District, but that's pretty good. Now the other thing we want to point out is there's lots of programming for students who are LGBTQ here in the district. There are clubs that are focused on these issues. There are activities. The evidence shows school district supports these activities. We met with the moderators of the clubs at CB West, at Hollicong. Good working relationships. Good people at those high schools. It works really well. There was only one Title IX complaint in the district related to sexual orientation discrimination during the period that OCR asked for. And Dr. Chad Waters, I interviewed him, good man, good educator, dropped everything to take care of it. Resolved the entire thing in 3 days. Pulled video footage, interviewed witnesses. I mean, this is a high school of 1,600 kids. Literally drops everything to address this circumstance. The evidence shows that this district puts a high priority on protecting students who allegedly suffered discrimination, bullying, or harassment. And you can see it in the documents. And the mother wrote, thank you for responding so quickly to the incident. And she appreciated the justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion that was shown. That's the school district's record on these sorts of issues. And I just want to explain what this Title IX compliance system is, right? And look, I want to make it very clear, the school district has no problem if someone wants to file an OCR complaint. In fact, school district's own publications tell people how to file an OCR complaint. Do whatever you want. That's your right. But what Andrew Burgess was not entitled to do was not report it to the school district and also discourage the student from following just what that parent and his child did. Right? This is one of the options that student one had, was to go through the district's internal process, which works. It's a 5-step process: intake, protection, investigation, a report, and if appropriate, corrective action by the district. So we also looked into other incidents as well. Roberta Gluck reported that the bulletin board for Saga was desecrated, the rainbow flag, flyer were ripped down. Janine Salo got on it right away. I mean, I'm going to tell you what she did. She pulled video footage, took care of this incredibly quickly. That's the kind of dedication that the district has to these issues. This one is a very telling email right here. This is a teacher rather, who writes to Janine Salo, during the No Place for Hate video this morning, students reported that another student was on his phone texting slurs to another student and being disrespectful. This teacher forwards it to Andrew Burgess. And then what does Andrew Burgess say? Thanks, if you can BDR this, I think it'll be best. Right there. So the teacher writes back, says, I gave Lauren the names. And here's what Andrew Burgess writes back. Sounds good. Lauren has been very responsive this year, so I'm confident balance will be restored. Feel free to keep me posted, and thanks for taking the step of reporting. I think it makes a big difference. Now, so what we have is a circumstance where in private, in emails with teachers, in that chat room, remember that? And even to student 2, after student 2 had reported the allegations to Lauren Dowd, what Mr. Burgess is saying is the school district is very responsive. It makes a big difference. Lauren Dowd will be right on it. She takes care of it same day or next day. But then when Andrew Burgess is talking to student 1 or his mother, or for that matter, the New York Times, he says something completely different. And each person in this room is going to have to ask themselves, why is that? Here's another instance where the guidance counselors at Lenape get right on an incident involving student 1. And so we also then went into the data, and you got 23 schools. This was a very extensive enterprise. Reviewed more than 1,000 incidents at Infinite Campus, which is one system that's used. We also did the SWIBIS BDR system. As you can see, there is some bullying of LGBTQ students in the district, but the important thing is we reviewed these incidents, and they were all addressed. And even these numbers are not particularly high. They're small, and they're addressed. It's unfortunate that in schools all over the country, there's going to be some degree of bullying. It does not seem particularly pervasive here. That's what the evidence shows. But more importantly, the evidence shows that the district is not indifferent to it. So let's move on to the fourth topic, which is the policies. So Board Policy 321, we looked at it, and we just wanted to make a few points. The first is that it's a neutral prohibition on employee advocacy. It doesn't prohibit curriculum-based discussion of partisan political or social policy issues. And it doesn't regulate student speech at all. And it's interesting, one of the ACLU lawyers who's handling this case actually spoke, we mentioned this in the report, actually agrees that it doesn't infringe First Amendment rights. And the reason for that's quite simple, which is when you're a public employee and you're on duty, You don't have the same First Amendment rights that you do on your own time and your own dime. It's a reasonable line drawing exercise, and the line had to be drawn somewhere. And the way that we do that is the Board of School Directors draws the line. We don't do it by federal investigation. And the other thing is we actually talked to administrators and teachers, and they agreed that these kinds of policies allow them to understand what they can and can't do, and agreed that it was a workable standard. And that was important to us. We wanted to hear what teachers and administrators had to say, and that's what they told us, by and large. Now, the name change request issue. So the policy of the district is going to use the student name in Infinite Campus, which then gets disseminated to everyone, so everyone knows what the information is, unless the parents or guardians direct otherwise. Parental consent requirement is supported by important constitutional rights and statutory protections. To put it simply, the children are the parents' children, right? Third is parental consent requirement reflects sound educational judgment. And I'll tell you what we heard from staff that we interviewed, which is when this conflict arises, it is the judgment of the school district that secrecy is not the best approach, right? You actually want to use your guidance counselors, and that's this whole thing about sending students to guidance. Students are not getting sent to guidance if the parents have already consented, right? If the parents consent to the name change, that is the beginning and end of the issue. But we found a few instances in the district, I think we counted 3, where there was a disagreement. And the school district has reasonably concluded that guidance counselors, because of their education, training, and experience, are best to help students navigate those issues. And that's where the requirement to see guidance comes. It affects a very small number of students, and the district has determined that it is not going to just change a kid's name behind the parent's back, or maybe even against the parent's wishes, and cause conflict. That the better, sounder approach, and also one consistent with those legal requirements, is better. And the alternative proved unworkable, right? You remember what I told you earlier on about Janine Salo and the program at the performance. Again, it's school leaders on the ground making decisions. We actually asked Andrew Burgess about this for what it's worth, and that's what he said. Now let's talk about the book policies. There were a lot of comments about books at meetings, and other school districts around the country have dealt with this differently, have dealt with it on an ad hoc basis. And what that does is it encourages people to come to meetings and complain about particular books, and decisions get made on the spot. And this district decided to do something different, which is to say, we're not going to make these on a one-off ad hoc basis. We're going to set up a neutral policy that sets a standard. If you want to complain, fill out a form. We'll have educators look at it. A recommendation will be made to the superintendent. And the superintendent, who is charged by Pennsylvania law with making decisions such as this, will decide. And to date, no book has actually been removed. It's important to remember, you can't have every book. You have to make choices. And the books don't spontaneously appear on the shelf. Somebody has decided to put them there. And the question is there any process to review that? And what the district has decided is, we're going to set a standard, we're going to set a practice, we're going to have committees made up of educators to make a recommendation. And to date, no book has actually been removed. And based on our review, that's appropriate. That doesn't mean that that couldn't be done in the wrong way. I mean, you could, in the future, make a decision that was wrong, but that can be taken up at the time. On its face, the policy is neutral. So let's just discuss these 3 policies, because at the end of the day, this is what the complaint is. That 321, the name change policy, and this policy affect a hostile environment for students in the district. And the evidence shows that's just not the case. Finally, we'll talk about that human growth and development class. Just a little bit of background on this. It was a 1-hour course once a year for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders the curriculum was actually the same in the 5th and 6th grade, but it was separated by sex for all grades. The important thing is the Title IX regulations actually explicitly say human sexuality classes can be divided into different groups for boys and girls. But in any event, the districts decided to restructure the class. Ultimately, it's just going to be 6th grade. It's going to be coeducational because, after all, it was the same curriculum in 6th grade anyway. So this really moved. So what you're left with are the 3 policies, and what they really are is a policy disagreement. And the policy was decided by the board or the administration. And there's no evidence that that affects a hostile environment in the schools. In fact, we reviewed that in connection with the bullying allegations. So our recommendations are as follows. The school district should suspend Mr. Burgess from his duties without pay. The school district should appropriately coordinate with student one's new school to ensure his needs are properly met. The school district should continue to follow its established building security protocols. The school district should continue to follow and enforce its Title IX compliance program, as well as its other formal and informal policies designed to address and prevent bullying, harassment, and discrimination. To the extent the school district continues to find the policies beneficial, it may continue to maintain and enforce Board Policies 109, 1091, 1092, 321, and the district's policies regarding student name and gender pronoun changes. And more fundamentally, my recommendation is to consider what you have here. You have one of the best school districts in the state. Consistently one of the highest academic performing schools in the state, proud academic, athletic, extracurricular tradition. You have modern buildings set on the backdrop of some of the most beautiful places in Pennsylvania. People literally move from around the world to come here. And that's my recommendation. Continue doing the good work you're doing and support the students, which is what your administrators and teachers and guidance counselors are doing every day. Thank you.